because I've called this the problem with men. Like there's a problem. Like I can possibly put my finger on it, particularly being inside a male body and all that shit. But also because there's some really, 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 really heinous shit that men do. I'm not going to swear all the way through, but I just wanted to try starting a talk like that once. Maybe I will. We'll see how it goes. Some really heinous shit that men do, and I can't apologize on behalf of all men, but you know, I can't focus tonight on the worst of it. We all were heartbroken last week with some stories about what men do, what some men do some of the time. But hopefully if we can come to some kind of an understanding of what drives men and what brings the worst out in men. And it really isn't just what brings out the worst in men. It just happens to be that the incentives are structured in a certain way for men. Then I hope that we can start to whittle away at those aggregate outcomes, at those just ridiculous statistics of the things that men do. To begin with, I think we could start with something that's just hilarious. And I don't find car accidents funny at all, but last Friday on Parramatta Road, 2 a.m., the witching hour of night, a Lamborghini swerved across the median strip and crashed into a taxi, and the poor taxi passenger had to go to hospital. She broke her leg. Terribly sad. Nobody was killed, though. So it's okay to make jokes about it because nobody was killed. And if you think, what do we know about this just by looking at that? It's a $400,000 car. Well, we know that alcohol might have been involved. We know that there was some showing off involved. But the one thing we can be absolutely certain of is that the driver was a man. Firstly, just that he was driving a Lamborghini at all means he was a man, and probably a young man, or a man going through a midlife crisis. So an artificially young man. And the other thing we know, what's the other thing we know? Oh, the fact that he crashed it, that he was driving it so badly, also indicates his inherently male incompetence in this area. And so, if we're to understand why it is that we can be so certain, it was a man, he was a 21-year-old dude with a 26-year-old male passenger. And if we can be so certain in forming a prejudice that this is going to be a dude driving this thing, then that says something about sex differences. Imagine if there was a gene that increased by tenfold your chance of being homicidal, your chance of being a murder victim, your chance of having autism, your chance of developing arteriosclerosis. There is such a gene. We know it's that gene over there with the arrows. It's called SRY, the sex-determining region on the Y chromosome. Now, one gene, and this just illustrates how ridiculous the sort of standard media discourse on genetics is, it's not like this gene alone does its work. It just starts a cascade in the embryo of development. And that gene interacts with all sorts of other genes throughout the genome and all sorts of environmental factors, such that we get a gradient of masculinity from Vin Diesel through to dudes like me. And similarly with women, there's no single standard of femininity. And unfortunately, the sex differences literature, both the scientific literature, but particularly the popular stuff, in the big journals like Vogue and Cosmo and the Daily Telegraph, really treats it as if there's this one gene and you're forever in this camp or that camp. Men are like this, women are like that, purely on the basis of inferences about average differences. I'm not that kind of scientist, although I'm going to talk a little bit in shorthand like a scientist like that tonight, okay? I'm going undercover as an evolutionary psychologist. If you look at the sex differences literature, really, you've got two camps as well. You've got the people who believe that humans are so changeable and that everything is socially constructed and that just with education and a reasonable conscientization campaign we could change anything about men and women and we could all pretty much do exactly the same thing right now. So I'll say that they're from Mercury. Social constructionists are from Mercury because it's mercurial, highly changeable. I did Latin at school. But then, from another planet further out in the solar system, which we'll call Uranus, come the biological determinists who are sort of slow-moving and plodding and think that everything basically boils down to dudes who lived in caves and went out hunting. And that was their main contribution, and women should be grateful for it. And women are keen to get together and chat about things mostly. So very, very stereotyped kind of view, okay? This is not that kind of talk. I'm just trying to distance myself from them. Because at some point I have to use some of the arguments that are out there in evolutionary psychology. How do sex differences come about? How do they evolve? One of the really, really important things about sex differences is the differences in the variation in mating success, to the fact that you get some winners and you get lots of losers. And that's a typical situation with men. Heaps and heaps of losers. And I mean the losers in the most empathic kind of sense, dudes who are just never going to have offspring of their own. They're never going to be able to buy that stake in society and in their community that having their offspring brings. You can tell I'm a parent because I'm sort of rhapsodizing about parenthood as if it's a really fun thing. Women, on the other hand, while there is variation and some women have heaps of kids and some women have none, the differences are much less dramatic. It's an incredibly difficult thing for those of you who are still young to carry a kid to term and to lactate for that kid, particularly to give birth. Whether it's through the traditional vaginal route or the more fashionable cesarean route, it fucking hurts, okay? And it's not convenient, neither of them. And for dudes, nothing about childbearing at all, except getting kicked in the nuts, is anywhere near that. I'm told, of course, because I can't completely empathize because I haven't given birth. But I'm told, and I'll take it on face value. But not a lot of women in history have had more than 12 kids, okay? 12 kids is pretty high. The most is 69 kids, I think. Most of them were multiple births. Many of them died. Even in the highest fertility societies that have ever been known, about 7 kids is the highest average. Whereas for dudes, you can have thousands and thousands of kids if the planets align perfectly. Like if, for instance, you were Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan, if there were a prize for the most successful individual in evolutionary history, it'd have to go to this guy, okay? Not a nice individual. Genghis Khan established the largest continuous empire that has ever existed in human history. And he did it, his favorite thing as far as he was concerned, and these are his own words, is to drive his enemy before him and take his enemy's wives and daughters to his bosom. Okay, and he took that part really fucking seriously. Not only Genghis Khan, but his son sort of got the habit as well. And when Kublai Khan welcomed Marco Polo to China, he had 7,000 women in his harem at the time. And it wasn't just like 7,000 women like, gee, I've got a lot of different types of Lego. It was people who were rotated through his bedroom at the period of their maximum fertility. This was about establishing a genetic dynasty. Now, we know this about Genghis Khan because around about the time that Khan was born, or perhaps a few decades beforehand, a mutation on the Y chromosome arose. Now, if you remember your genetics, Y chromosomes passed only from father to son to son to son to son. This mutation was almost certainly present in Genghis Khan. He passed it on to his sons, who passed it on to his grandsons, etc., etc. How many people today have that mutation? 2% of every 2% of all men currently walking the face of the earth. 8% of all men in Asia can trace themselves, not just back to, Genghis Khan was a relative of mine, directly through the male line back to Genghis Khan. Okay? Which means that you and me, just about everybody here, probably who isn't North American First Nations or Aboriginal Australian, everybody else has got at least a little bit of Genghis Khan in them. And so you can imagine that genes that say when the opportunity arrives to be Genghis Khan, then take that opportunity, baby. Those genes have been favored by natural selection, or actually by sexual selection, which is a form of natural selection. Most men, however, have to deal with the fact that they're never going to be Genghis Khan, because there's this really oppressive piece of algebra out there, and that is that every kid has one mum and one dad. So no matter how successful you are with the ladies, the average mating success of all men and the average mating success of all women is going to be equal. So, for every Genghis Khan, who's down this end of the graph of the dark blues over here or up there on the right-hand side, who has thousands and thousands and thousands of offspring, there are literally thousands of other men who have no kids at all, which is not the same relationship for women. So what happens for the average man who has no chance at all of being Genghis Khan, his first priority, his evolved agenda, is to avoid being one of those men who has no kids at all. And so for most of our ancestors, they were striving for their entire lives to get enough status, enough respect, and enough attention to have at least one kid with one woman. And so what did they have to do? Well, they transactionalized the whole thing. I'm not saying men did, women did too. It was a transactional bargain. Men will contribute by going out and slaying big shit that's going to be edible, or perhaps protecting women from other men, which are very, very dangerous things. And women will choose to have sex with him and him alone, or at least reassure him that he's the only one that they've ever slept with, even if it is once a night with the lights off under the covers, on a Saturday usually. This view, of course, is very simplistic, and I've been incredibly offensive in doing so purely because I need to hold your attention, because beer is more interesting. But it gives a sort of a Madonna-like oblivion to the female agenda. There's a whole interesting female agenda that I'd love to talk about, but I'm not going to talk about it because I would still be here tomorrow. Okay? I'm concentrating largely on dudes, so that's my next apology. Sorry for the hugely androcentric point of view here. But let's have a quick look here. Does it always have to be that there's lots of losers and a couple of Genghis Khans? Sometimes, like here in Sydney, we have what we call metrosexuals, which is the slightly paler blue there. And the distribution of fitness, as you might notice, is actually more similar to the female distribution. In fact, it's identical to the female distribution, and that's because I went into Photoshop and changed the color on the distribution. That's not actually empirical data, that's schematic. But nonetheless, sometimes in some societies, some of the time, the distribution of male fitness effects looks a bit more feminine than it did in Genghis Khan's time. And we happen to be living quite happily in one of those times. So what happens? I'll just read these out because what happens when you have a Genghis Khan-like situation with a huge variation in male mating success is that you get very bad health for men. There's lots of warfare. There's lots of frantic striving for status and respect, both within society and by going abroad and sort of getting all colonialist about it and trying to beat the crap out of the people in the next village or the next country. Men basically discount the future. As Jim Morrison says, I don't know what's going to happen, baby, but I just want to get my kicks before the whole shithouse comes down in flames, okay? And that's exactly what dudes do under those circumstances. They discount the future, they work hard, they play hard, and they get very aggressive. And occasionally, that spills over into the kind of, were you looking at me? Were you looking at my girlfriend? You know she's my girlfriend. She's not your girlfriend. She's my girlfriend. And then there's blows exchanged, and then someone hits their head on the pavement, and somebody dies. That's how most homicide takes place, okay? That jostling for status and respect. And that happens much more when the distribution of fitness effects is very widely distributed, because the incentives are really strong. Incentive to avoid being an evolutionary loser, incentive to become Genghis Khan. When you have the more metrosexual distribution, guys take more interest in their kids. They kind of have to. They're more faithful to their partners. There's greater gender equity in the society, and both men and women live longer, and they suffer fewer healthcare problems. In the Soviet Union and the Soviet states, the states behind the Iron Curtain, as we used to say in the olden days, when that fell in the late 1980s, early 1990s, male mortality went up by about, male lifespan went down by about 10 years in those countries. It didn't happen in Western Europe. It only happened in those areas. And basically, with the economy opening up and the opportunities to suddenly become a fucking plutocrat, suddenly become one of Vladimir Putin's buddies and earns gazillions of dollars, but also the opportunity to become an enormous loser as the communist economy imploded, men strived crazily. Violence went up, but also heart disease and all of those other things that kill men slightly less dramatically. So what are the three things? There are three things that I want to talk about that influence which of these types of society we live in. The first is the sex ratio. Basically, when there's too many men or too many women, then something kind of goes a little bit wrong. It's strange, but evolution tends to keep the sex ratio more or less 50-50, for reasons I won't go into now. But when there are too many women, or shall you say when there are more women than men, I'd much rather live in a more women than men society for not only just selfish reasons, but Marriage rates go down, divorces go up, male infidelity goes up, basically because dudes don't have to commit to marriages. Okay, they have slightly more options. It's exactly like the 1970s. In fact, it's exactly what happened in the late 1960s and early 1970s and what drove a lot of rock and roll. Teenage sex also goes up and single motherhood also goes up, basically because girls have to compete for the few men that are available on the mating market. So really all the things that conservatives are completely fucked up about, if you look at the Republican campaign right now, it's the kind of thing that they get confused about and that they think means they're signs of the end times. Much worse, however, if you live in a society where there are too many men. Men marry later because they basically have to accumulate wealth in order to compete, in order to attract wives, or sometimes in those societies in order to basically have wives' parents allocate them in a strategic bargain to them. But that's another unhappy story we won't get into today. Men compete more, there's more crime, there's more violence, there's more warfare. Horrible situation happening right now in India and China. Right now, because of very strong sun preferences in northwest India and in the Han Chinese majority, and because of the spread of ultrasound and for different reasons, easy access to abortion in those two countries, we now have 100 million extra young men who are going to come on the mating market in the next 20 years because parents are often leaving the first child's sex up to nature, but then for the second and subsequent children, they're not taking any chances and they're ensuring that they have a boy, okay? Which you can read more about in the book. It's a hideous story. But the problem with that is that brings on all sorts of horrible evils. The economist Lena Edland has estimated, due to the way in which economists work with the rollout of particular policies, looking at differences in the timing of the rollout of China's one-child policy, and therefore when the spike in sex ratios occurred, she's demonstrated that for every 1% increase in the sex ratio, so from 110 boys to every 100 girls, to 111 to every 100 girls, for every 1% change, there is a 6% increase in the rate of property and violent crime. And you can be sure that the rates of prostitution, and particularly trafficking women for prostitution, and drug use and alcohol abuse and all those things are also going up. It's not a nice situation. It is one of the great humanitarian crises, not just the sex-biased abortion thing, which is tragic on its own, but also what's going to happen when you've got too many men. It's one of the big factors that we're going to face in the next 20 years. It's also likely to cause regional instability. Societies that have had too many men in the past, small-scale societies, where going over the hill and beating the crap out of your neighbor doesn't actually have global consequences, those societies have tended to be much more warlike. And so there is concern as to whether or not places in India and China, where the sex ratio is very distorted, are going to become more bellicose and belligerent, both within those countries and whether those countries themselves are going to find policy changed by this inherent demographic issue. All right, I'll try to get slightly less serious for a moment. Polygyny. It's actually not all that funny either. Jacob Zuma. Jacob Zuma is the president of South Africa. He has 4 wives. He's had 6. 1 divorced him, 1 committed suicide. And the suicide was very much connected to the fact that Jacob Zuma was not investing very much in her and her offspring, but merely as his influence rose and as his wealth rose, he took more wives. So here we have a conflict of interest between the wife and the husband. So polygyny creates this huge conflict of evolutionary interests between women and the wealthy men who are able to become polygynist, but it also creates a lot of evolutionary losers. A lot of young men who are the poorest young men who are unable to buy that stake in society that comes with having a wife and family, unable to attract that first wife, turn to violence and crime and all of those things that are happening in China now. In China, it's happening because of sex ratio, but it's the same problem. Too many men with no prospects at all. In South Africa, no coincidence that it happens to be a place that is one of the most violent places on earth. It's also one of the most economically inequitable places on earth. A lot of that has to do with its apartheid history. I'm not just saying traditional polygyny in the Zulu kingdom and a few other tribal groups is driving this, but it's not a good look for the head of state to be doing that. Similarly, religious cults in which magically people like Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormons, or David Koresh, or Jim Jones, said, and by the way, God, I was just speaking to him, and he said, I can have sex with your wife and your daughter, and I can even have sex with you, in the case of Jim Jones, who was not at all heterosexual. He was very bisexual in his sort of reproductive or sexual despotism that he exercised. So nobody really saw Joseph Smith's evidence, but they took him at face value. And so the Mormons got a really huge problem with the rest of America because people's sensibilities are offended by dudes who have lots and lots of wives. Because what does that mean? It means there's lots of other men who never get a chance to marry. So polygyny also has this heinous effect. Now the last thing is wealth inequality. Wealth inequality has more or less the same effect. If you happen to be Mitt Romney and have lots and lots and lots of money, well, I'm not saying Mitt Romney's a polygynist, okay? Especially if there's YouTube shit going on here. But he is a Mormon, okay? But if you happen to be as wealthy as Mitt Romney, well, you can have a wife and many mistresses because you're incredibly wealthy. And what does that do? It means that there are a lot of men down at the poor end of this economic inequality bargain who are unable to ever buy that stake in society. They're striving to avoid becoming one of those evolutionary losers. And what do you get? You get all of those unintended consequences, including homicide. So here's a nice graph, and the graph is really about economic inequality in American states. Each data point, each of the open data points is an American state. Each of the closed data points is a Canadian province. And what you can see is that the more inequality there is in the state, the greater the homicide rate. Canada has lower homicide rates, not because Michael Moore likes Canada and because Canadians don't like guns as much as Americans. Unfortunately, I mean, it pains me to admit this. I always think there should be a mental test for gun ownership, and there should be one question, and the question is, do you want a gun? And if you say yes, you fail, and you can't have a gun. But anyway, it pains me to admit this, that it's the gross differences at this level are not due to differences in gun ownership, but differences in inequality in Canada and the USA. But homicide, that kind of homicide that I'm talking about is really confined to young men. The men in particular, but men through their reproductive years into their late 40s, but with this huge spike in the early 20s. So that graph is England and Wales in black, and the line down the bottom, just above the bottom axis, is female homicide, and you can see not a lot of female homicide, okay? And then dudes sort of start out just like girls before they hit puberty, and they're not committing much homicide, and nobody likes when children commit homicide, and it really gets on the news. And then in their 70s and 80s, they're also really shit at it. Sorry, I shouldn't be talking about homicide that way, but anyway. And then in the middle, dudes are really quite practiced at homicide. And in Chicago, like England and Wales, the graph sits on top of each other's. That's what we call in evolutionary statistics a get the fuck out moment. Why do those graphs just look exactly the same? Except for the fact that in Chicago, there's 900 homicides per 100,000 individuals, and in England and Wales, there's 30. So it's a different homicide rate, but the timing is all about essentially when dudes are desperately striving for mating success. Inequality is the reason, I guess, that Chicago has this higher homicide rate than England and Wales, at least. It's part of the reason. Inequality has all sorts of other nasty effects. It's associated, national inequality rates are associated with obesity, with alcoholism, with teenage pregnancy, with political instability, with religion or disease. I'm not sure what that bottom left-hand one is. All the evils of society. And even with hip-hop. This is really about incentive structures. For men, it's about the evolved incentive structure of, can I get to have sex with lots of women or not? Or can I get to have sex with one woman and raise a child with one woman? Or am I going to be one of those dudes who has none at all? Now, for women, those incentive structures might seem incredibly different, but of course, we also have reproductive success and evolutionary success through our sons and through our daughters. And what I'm hoping to look at is what does it do to the brain of a mum who has boys compared to a brain of a mum who has daughters? We know that in northern India, some of the worst gender oppression is exerted by mothers-in-law, the mother of the son. She only gets the first time a woman gets any power at all in the society is when she becomes the mother of a successful son, when she's the mother of a son who becomes successful. Okay, so what I want to say here is that some of these incentive-based arguments work for men and for women. Also, there's a negative side to the problem with men. And that is, a positive side, sorry. We get all of this, we venerate dudes like Warney and Tiger Woods. I mean, Tiger Woods said he was a sex addict. I don't know that he was a sex addict. I think he was just an incredibly wealthy young man. What is it that has a dude out there practicing hitting the covers of thousands and thousands of golf balls? Is he thinking, oh yes, I'm going to win the Masters 17 times and I'm going to have lots of money and I might have a very flash car? Or is he thinking about something a little more animal, a little more basic? Sorry. And if anybody embodies this, it's rock stars. And I don't mean just male rock stars, I mean also female rock stars. But one of the things you'll notice about any list of the top rock stars is that it's very, very deeply male biased. Music, just to give you another thing to think about, music really is all about sex. If you think about any courtship that you know, your own courtship probably, or any relationship you're going back, has it ever started outside of the earshot of an iPod or a band or a DJ? Or a mixtape, for those of you who are about 100 years old like me. The serenade. The serenade was a thing that they did in Italy. That was how courtship worked in 17th century Italy. Up in the top middle are the love markets of northern Vietnam, where single, and not even necessarily single, people go and they sing and they dance and they have a roll in the bushes and then they go back to business the next day. Sinatra reckoned that 40% of the kids in the United States were conceived to one of his songs at one time. Music is essentially a courtship tool. It is a tool that we use. We play the music of our favorite musicians in our courtship, but that's really a pale imitation of what the musicians themselves are doing. It is the peacock's tail. It is more sublime than any peacock's tail, in fact, which is just a hackneyed imitation of what Jimi Hendrix's music was. But it comes with a lot of danger. That opportunity to strive to be Jimi Hendrix and to have sex with a different person every single night, that opportunity also comes at an enormous cost. Now, Jimmy paid the price. Keith Richards didn't pay the price. At least he didn't pay the price in dying, but he paid the price in terms of the way that his body looks and feels right now. But nonetheless, rock stars have a 5 times higher mortality. So let's just compare those, the metrosexual kind of rock star, or should we say the rock star of today, The Edge. I mean, what's The Edge ever done? He solved third world debt, and he's been a nice bloke, but the psychoanalyst Robert Jesse Stoller has this wonderful quote which says, "Kitsch is the corpse that's left when art has lost its anger." And I think that's what happened to rock and roll, and that's why we have fucking U2 and not Jimi Hendrix. The true inheritors of rock's anger, of course, are dudes like Curtis Jackson. Curtis Jackson had a pretty rough upbringing, but nowadays he's so rich, he merchandises water. We know him as 50 Cent. And he wrote the anthem, his first album, that the title is the anthem of the angry young man striving to come from absolutely nothing and avoid being a complete evolutionary loser, either because he got shot or because he simply was never able to attract anybody, or because nobody respected him. And 50 Cent happened to make it all the way through that, and he happened to succeed. He got rich. He didn't die trying. And so I'll leave you tonight. We'll try to show you a video from another rapper. This rapper is not 50 Cent. He doesn't look as tough as 50 Cent, and don't let him be put off. He truly has a baby face. But this is Nerd Night, and I thought, what more could nerds enjoy than my man Bubba Brinkman?